Okay, so I've got James Hughes with us today, and we're going to be talking about the conference that's coming up in December called Personhood Beyond the Human. So, James, would you like to tell us what the conference is about and why you're putting the conference on or helping out with it?
Sure. Well, I wrote this book 10 years ago called Citizen Cyborg, and the principal argument of Citizen Cyborg was that we needed to create a new standard for what a citizen is and what the basis of citizenship rights are, that separates it from humanness. And so this non-anthropocentric personhood argument, which I had inherited and adapted from the work of Peter Singer and other philosophers in the animal rights movement, and applied to cyborg theory and the notion that not only should we be extending certain kinds of human rights to great apes and to cetaceans, but also to humans who've been modified in radical ways, to animals that have been modified with cognition enhancement, and to potentially to machines. So this was a very central idea of my work with the World Transhumanist Association. Then when we started the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies, it's been one of our core ideological foci. And we had not done much on it until recently. The chairman of our board, George Dvorsky, who lives in Toronto, he had been fooling around with the idea of starting his own nonprofit organization to promote this specific idea. And I convinced him that he could easily do this through the IET. And so we started the non-human rights project within the IET. And eventually we reached out to the Non-Human Rights Project, which was started, and one of the other thinkers who had inspired our work in this area was Stephen Weiss. He was is an attorney who lives in Florida, but has taught at Harvard and other places. And he had written books called Drawing the Line, one very influential book called Drawing the Line, arguing that it was possible to use current ethological data about animal cognition and animal behavior to distinguish which animals in general had the cognitive capacities that we in bioethics think are necessary for personhood. But again, back in Citizen Cyborg, I had used arguments like that to argue why we should make certain distinctions in the rights and prerogatives of embryos and fetuses and newborns and people with brain damage and chimps and so forth. And Stephen Weiss is doing this basically in the sphere of animal rights. Now, his work in this sphere, a lot of people in the area of animal rights see as kind of the camel's nose under the tent, that once we get people to acknowledge the rights of great apes and dolphins on the basis of personhood, then we can get them to get rid of factory farming and become vegetarians and things like that. For me, excuse me, for me, the arguments in fact immediately diverge. I'm not a vegetarian. The argument of animal personhood argues that you shouldn't be killing and farming great apes, that bushmeat is a bad idea, and you should be protecting dolphins from being caught in tuna nets. But it doesn't really say anything about the morality of eating cows, especially if you sneak up behind them and kill them real quick, or stun them, which is something I actually asked Peter Singer once, if it was okay if you were able to sneak up behind a chicken and zap it real quick. If it lived a happy life up until that moment, would that be okay? And since it's not a person, and one of the arguments here is that one of the moral significances of being a person is that you have sufficient cognition of your own existence to look forward to say, oh, what happened to all the other chickens? Why? And to be anxious about the fact that you're mortal If you're not at that point cognitively, you don't have the same kind of anxiety about your impending doom. Um, at any rate, this conference that we're organizing, Beyond the Human, is an effort to bring together IET folks who want to talk about things like robot rights and the rights of aliens, and the different kinds of philosophical and interesting questions that get raised about this in the transhumanist community, with the folks in the animal rights community who are working on the practical day-to-day legal challenges to force courts to extend rights bearing beyond humans to apes in particular, and then to dolphins also.
Excellent.
So that good.
Yeah. So part of I think I read in Citizen Cyborg that you believe the requirements for personhood is that the animal should be able to be self-reflective or have some form of self-awareness and desire. And I imagine that would also include the ability to foresight, to achieve goals and desire, the outcomes of those goals. Do you want to discuss about that, why you believe that those are the two major underpinnings to what it means to be a person? If I understood you correctly.
Yeah, I think the place to start is actually with the beginning of moral significance, which is that the capacity to experience pain is, I think, where we need to begin. And for some in the animal rights community, this is, the end of the discussion. If you can experience any kind of pain, then you're a morally significant being, and we shouldn't be killing you. For me, the question is legitimate pain and the balance of the pain that one causes to creatures vis-a-vis the benefits. So, for instance, use of animals in farming, we certainly should, for the purposes of meat, we certainly should create farming technologies that minimize animal pain, ways of allowing them to live with minimal pain. And current factory farming is terrible at that, but there are many efforts to improve the humaneness of farming. And eventually we should have stem cell meat so that we don't have any nerves involved in our food at all. And I strongly support that avenue. In medical research, one has to create an equation. How many rabbits would it be legitimate to torture to death if it meant that you might be able to save one human being? And I don't know how to do that equation, but there are some. I think it's legitimate to torture 20 rabbits, I don't know, 50 rabbits, something like that, for one human being. So that kind of suggests that, my moral intuition about this is that, yes, we want to minimize the suffering of creatures, but the persons, the beings that have this capacity for self-reflection, they get an order of magnitude more moral significance in these equations. And so then who are the persons, and what are the cognitive characteristics that are necessary for personhood? Now, the reason that cognitive characteristics have to be the focus is that the reason that we create the illusion of moral significance is because we are self-aware creatures in the universe. Because when I look into your eyes, my intuition, none of us can prove that anybody else is conscious, but our intuition is that the other person has a mind like ours. And so we have created this social contract that we will all acknowledge one another's subjectivity. And just as you don't want to be tortured, and you want other people to respect your individuality and your personhood, you should respect theirs. Now, so then the question is, which creatures do you look into the eyes and feel that with, right? Who gets to be in that circle? And it has to be creatures that have certain kinds of cognitive capacities. One is the capacity to experience themselves as creatures that exist through time and that have certain plans and intents and a certain illusion of personal identity over time. Now, we know that creatures that like lower mammals like rats, they have a certain sense of self. They exhibit certain kinds of social behaviors that look a lot like human social behavior, and certain intents and purposes over time. But the personhood tests are things like, do you recognize yourself in the mirror, and things like that. Some of these ethological efforts to kind of examine animal cognition. And what we discover is that often we aren't able to find the same kind of cognition in lower mammals, and certainly not in other species except for parrots, um, that we find in the higher mammals. And that what we're doing with rats, and I actually have a strong argument with my managing director, Chris Notaro, because he was very much in love with his rats, who he has one living and one recently died, and insisted that they were conscious in various ways. And I have been arguing with him. Look, all the literature shows that rats just don't have it. Whenever you think you see it in a rat, you're actually just imputing it to a rat. And people impute it to their Roombas. They look at their household robots. They look at their lawnmowers and see these kinds of behaviors and cognition. So this is one of the features of the human brain, is that we are constantly looking for mind in other creatures. And we see it in mountains, and we see it in trees, and we see it in the weather. We see it all over the place. Well, that's where the illusion of God comes from. So we have to be very careful that we don't impute it into things that it doesn't actually exist in, like lower mammals. Where it's clearly present, I think, it's in the apes and the cetaceans.
Okay, apes and cetaceans. What about octopuses and like intelligent sort of, yeah.
Well, the problem with research on parrots and octopi and elephants and a couple of other creatures is that there have been their brains are either structured in such different ways that it's very difficult to perform the tests on them, or we don't have sufficient amount of ethological evidence. So, it's just very difficult to live with elephants. Well, of course, people have been training elephants for a long time, living with elephants. But in terms of the amount of research on elephant cognition, it isn't the same body of research that's been done on the great apes and on dolphins. Parrots, we basically just have one really dramatic, I forget the woman's name, but one parrot researcher here in the United States who has done some really dramatic work on parrot cognition with a parrot that she trained over the course of 30 years, and then a lot of other anecdotal accounts that they may have some of those cognitive traits as well. So there are a couple different animals that have exhibited remarkable cognition, and maybe we'll have to include them as well.
Yeah. So it's interesting. We're only really including what we know about the animals that we've studied. So it's hard to say that maybe some of the lower forms of animals don't have any form of self-awareness, consciousness, or whatnot. At the moment, I guess we don't have the resources to benefit from, or we don't have the technology to have in vitro meat, and so we put animals through, I guess, various degrees of suffering in order to achieve, yes, like dinner on the table. So, but in your opinion, what are the actual underpinnings? Like, back to the question, is it the neocortex that makes somebody a person, or some animal a person? What role, what role does the neocortex play in personhood and affective states of sentience? And what other parts of the brain or cognitive architectures do you think are important?
Well, Claire, as you suggest, the neocortex is pretty centrally important. It's I think what's an interesting part of your question is that if we just had the neocortex, would it be sufficient? Would some of the emotive architecture of the brain, if we were to remove that, and we've had other discussions about moral enhancement and neurotechnologies and what moral consequences those might have. So it's possible, it's certainly possible to imagine in machine intelligence, but it's also possible to imagine in human neurotinkering that you might turn off a lot of what we consider to be the human emotions and just have, your logical neocortex. Now, the people who have suffered that kind of brain damage usually are not terribly functional. Damasio is famous for showing that when the connection between the emotive parts of the brain and the decision-making parts of the brain have been severed, that it's impossible for people to make any decisions at all because they don't, part of a decision-making architecture is feeling the need to make a decision, which is an emotion, and feeling the need to come to a decision because you're tired of thinking about things and you need to get something else done, which is an emotion. So, just pure rationality by itself is inert. We are driven by various emotions. So I do think that you're right that there are other architectures other than the neocortex that are necessary for what we would consider full personhood. By the way, this is an argument that I have with the friendly AI crowd. They have often argued that, or they implicitly argue that what they want to create is a super AI that only cares about other people's feelings, our feelings, humanity's feelings in general. Doesn't have feelings of its own, doesn't have a desire for self-preservation. And by the way, I'm hearing some of my own feedback. Are you hearing that at all or not?
No, no, no. But I can actually turn you down.
Oh yeah, if you just turn me down a bit.
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay, okay. Good. There's just a little bit of feedback coming through.
Yeah.
So anyway, the friendly AI people imply that you could create this kind of super AI, which wouldn't care about itself. And my retort to that notion is that a creature that only cares about your feelings and doesn't have any feelings of its own is in fact a tool and an extension of your own cognition and your own mind. It's not in fact a fully developed mind of its own. And so, to the extent that they really want to create fully developed minds, they are going to create creatures that have desires for self-preservation and for their own ends. But anyway, separate debate.
So back to the conference theme, which is apes and uplifters or personhood beyond being human. So there's a chapter in which you've discussed quite at length what it means to be like achieve personhood or have personhood. So do you want to talk about actually the Great Ape Project that Peter Singer and other activists has been spearheading? Is that going to be part of the conference? Are you covering the Great Ape Project?
Well, we're certainly going to talk about the aims of the Great Ape Project. That is one of the most effective of the NGOs working towards these ends. They are not formally represented in the organization of the conference. Our co-partner in this is the Non-Human Rights Project, which is headed by Steve Weiss. But Peter Singer is going to be at the conference and will be keynoting at the conference. We're also trying to get Judge Richard Posner, who's fascinating legal theorist and someone who's written about these issues. He's not a fan of this particular project, but who has been an interlocutor with Steve Weiss on these topics. And we've got a lot of folks already. The conference is like 8 months away, but we've got a lot of folks who are signing up to be speakers, and I think it's going to be very exciting. The Yale Center for Bioethics is the co-sponsor of the conference with us, and that's why we're holding it at Yale. And they have an animal rights ethics group at Yale as well. So yeah, the Great Ape Project got started, Wow, way back in the 70s, I guess. Maybe it was the 80s. But they came out with a book and then started the NGO. And their most dramatic successes have been getting some legislation proposed in Spain to extend human rights to great apes, and that got stalled by Spanish politics. But they have had a lot of success in getting the EU and the United States to take more seriously uh, the argument that there is no legitimate grounds for doing human medical experimentation on great apes. And so the National Institutes for Health, the National Science Foundation have recommended that the elimination of all medical research on great apes, and it's almost completely outlawed in the EU as well.
Hmm. Well, there's an interesting, I guess, parallel to Harry Potter that you make in Citizen Cyborg, where you highlight Hermione's efforts to for the promotion of elf welfare. Um, and so through her abolitionism is met with like the similar sort of disagreements or oppositions to slavery a couple of hundred years ago. And so
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a great example. So do you want to talk about the bias towards an aristocratic race and class prejudice against non-humans, and especially Lord Voldemort's fascism, and yeah, and what Hermione and Dumbledore have to say about inclusion of elves and half giants or whatever they are into the sphere of personhood.
Well, when I was writing the book, I was reading the Harry Potter series to my children, and it was a big part of our family life. So I was fascinated with the ways that J.K. Rowling, and of course now J.K. Rowling's politics have become a little bit more clear. Her left sympathies, but if they weren't clear in the fifth book, which was basically an anti-fascist dream sequence of creating Dumbledore's army and then leading a final conflict for the liberation of England from fascism in the sixth and seventh book. But yeah, I mean, I think that the a lot of the class and race politics encoded in the Harry Potter series, and which you can also see in a lot of science fiction and a lot of fantasy literature today, is a commentary and an extrapolation of race and class politics in our society in general. But what's interesting is when you transpose that into the context of fantasy, where there are actual intelligent non-human races, then the racism becomes what I have called human racism. It is, the only case, the only situation right now in which we legitimately can be accused of human racism, as far as I'm concerned, is in the way that we treat great apes and cetaceans. That's why we're holding this conference. But a lot of the bioethics, a lot of the bioconservative arguments against human enhancement have been essentially human racist arguments. They've been the argument that there is something called humanness that has to be preserved, because if we were to give up this humanness, all hell would break loose. And then you press them on, well, what is this humanness that's so important? And it's not entirely clear. And why doesn't an elf have humanness, or why wouldn't an enhanced human have humanness? Why would someone who lives twice as long as humans do today not be human? All of these arguments kind of evaporate. But what you see when it's transposed into this kind of fantasy genre is exactly the same arguments, just writ into that world. And so I thought it was very fascinating. And Voldemort, of course, is a great bête noire of that, because he not only is a racist towards the non-wizarding races, but he's also a fascist, in that he wants to establish a dictatorial reign of terror against them all. It's not, he's not just a snob; he's actually a fascist dictator. So
Interesting. So, yeah, are there any other particular fiction that you like to reference when, I guess, as metaphors for the non-human rights project?
Well, I mentioned that the IET has a project on depictions of intelligent life and the future and emerging technologies in popular culture. And we've held conferences on this topic. We have an ongoing engagement with science fiction authors and other content producers and critics about the tropes, the kind of bioconservative tropes that often get introduced in the genre. My interest in this, I've been a consumer of science fiction since I was a kid. And I taught a course 24 years ago now, or 23 years ago, on the politics of science fiction in Chicago. And I got very interested in studying popular culture and the effects of popular culture on people's political attitudes and the effects of people's political attitudes on the popular culture that they consumed. So one of the things I was curious about in bioethics was how the pretty common idea in science fiction of non-anthropocentric personhood might be reflected in their bioethical thinking. So I did a survey back 20 years ago now of bioethicists and graduate students, all kinds of people. It was a survey of convenience, but I had about 500 or 600 people in the survey. And I asked them whether they watched Star Trek The Next Generation, which was a TV show at the time, and whether they read science fiction very often. And then I had asked them about a whole series of animals. And I said, do you think that this kind of animal should be used in painful and lethal medical experiments that would benefit human beings? And their animals ranged from rats to great apes. And what my hypothesis was is that the more science fiction people consume, the more likely they would be to have a sharp distinction in their mind between the rights that should be given to lower animals, cognitively lower animals, and the rights that should be given to higher cognitive animals. And that the less science fiction that you read, the more likely you were to either think that all animals should be treated equally well, or all animals should be treated equally poorly. You know, they should all be sacrificed to human interests, or they should all be protected. But that what the implicit ethic in science fiction, and you saw this in the show Star Trek Next Generation very clearly in the way that Data, the court scene with Data, because there's this one wonderful episode where a scientist comes on the ship and he wants to take Data, the robot, apart, and they have an actual trial. What is a person? You know, what rights do I have as a conscious being? Do I have the right of self-possession? And they make the non-anthropocentric personhood case in that episode, and that I think you can see throughout the ethos of science fiction, why, you know, we should treat Klingons as equals. You know, why the whole idea of the Federation is that you meet another intelligent species and you don't consider them your implacable enemy. You eventually you should invite them into the polity of the Federation. So at any rate, what I did find, and I published a paper back 20 years ago, was that science fiction consumption was correlated with this ethical distinction that I had proposed, and that line of reasoning was what kind of led to the interest in popular culture and the IET. And one of the early projects of the IET was to identify images of non-human intelligence in popular culture and try to critique them. We never had the technical chops to make that work, but we had about 200 images and popular books and TV shows and movies in our website before we shut that down.
Oh, that's a shame you shut it down. Anyway.
Yeah.
So, what do we need to do in order to further define and clarify the line between personhood and non-personhood, if there is one? So what research needs to be done to better determine the difference, and how do we enable the resources for that research?
Well, I think your epistemological question about whether we're really sure that lower mammals don't have it is an important one. And so there are ways in which we could improve the ethological experimentation. So it took some time to figure out how to do, for instance, the mirror test with dolphins. The mirror test is you hold a mirror in front of a creature, and does it treat the image that it sees as another creature like itself, but not itself? Or does it eventually figure out that the creature in the mirror is itself? Now, I don't consider that, that's kind of like the Turing test, insofar as, the Turing test is an interesting experiment to see whether machine intelligence behaves sufficiently human that it would fool another human, but it doesn't really tell us what's going on inside of the phenomenology of the mind of the machine, right? It doesn't really tell us if the machine is thinking and feeling like a human being. It just tells us that it's sufficiently black boxy output is able to fool a human being. So the mirror test really doesn't tell us anything terribly significant, but it's one of these tests that is used in ethological research to try to figure out if they have some of the same cognitive architecture that we do about personhood and personal identity. I think increasingly, as we're able to map the genome and the connectome of the brains of humans and animals, that we'll be able to identify the neural architectures and genomes and chemistries that create various phenomenological experiences, that mystery of consciousness. And the more that we unravel that, the more that we'll be able to say, well, this creature just doesn't have what it takes to create this kind of phenomenology.
But we have to do something really today based on what we know and what we can infer.
Right.
So, I mean, that's going to be part of the conference too. What can we do today with the resources we have, the knowledge that we have, and what we can infer about what it means to be, what it means to be a person, really.
Right, and I'm perfectly content to work in a coalition with people who want to take this, all the way to rats. I don't want to take it all the way to rats. I don't think the evidence will support it, or the full philosophical arguments will support it. But what the argument of the Non-Human Rights Project is, the project of the Non-Human Rights Project, and of the Great Apes Project, is to try to pursue this through the courts, to establish through American common law and European common law and through constitutional law that you don't have to be a human to be subject to the protections of the law. And I think once we get that recognition for a chimp or a gorilla or a dolphin in the courts, then we've got that ball rolling, and we can start having that debate. Now, the American Supreme Court, when it legalized abortion with Roe v. Wade, it did it in a dumb way. It did it by saying that viability was the moral significance line for when a fetus went from being the property of the mother's body to having a moral significance of its own. And viability is not a legitimate line to draw, particularly because that constantly is changing. I mean, it may be that we'll be able to have extrauterine viability from the moment of conception all the way to being a baby. And so a lot of people in the pro-life movement are saying, yippee, because if it's just extrauterine viability, then as soon as a woman says she wants to have an abortion, we'll just pop that baby out of her and stick it in a artificial uterus, and we'll have fetal rescue going on all over the place instead of abortion, legal abortion. I don't think that that was a legitimate ground for the court to draw a line for the court to draw. We need to force the courts to confront the moral significance of the cognitive capacities. Now, I'm not saying that the court in 1973 in the United States had the sufficient, investigation or neurology behind it yet at that time to say what the neurology and the phenomenology of a fetus and a uterus is. We still are trying to figure that out. But that was the legitimate ground that they should have been grappling with. Now, the similar case with chimpanzees is that 10 years ago, the activist Jeremy Rifkin and Stuart Newman, they tried to patent humanzee in the U.S. patent courts. And the grounds that they were trying to force the U.S. Patent Court and then eventually the Supreme Court to confront was how much genome from the human being could a creature have before it was unpatentable, because patenting a human being would violate the 14th Amendment. Slave would be slavery. And so where would the line be between humanness and non-humanness? Again, exactly the wrong question. It's not a genetic line. It's as stupid as asking the viability question. The line is a cognitive line. It's an emotional, it's what happens inside the brain, right? So you can have something that is 100% human genome that should be patentable, in my opinion. And you could have, although I'm opposed to the patenting of genes in general, but the line is not human genome, because bananas have 60% of human genome. The line is what happens inside the brain. And you can have a chimp, or you could have a cow, or you could have a horse that had just a couple gene tweaks that were the human cognition gene tweaks that would make it a thinking being that should give it those moral capacities. So at any rate, that's what we need to force the courts and eventually the laws to reflect.
Interesting. So let's just say we had a society of radical abundance and safety, okay? Um, would the line between personhood and non-personhood and the rights granted be more inclusive, do you think? So, in other words, imagine a scenario where we didn't need to eat chickens, but of all chickens that existed, we'd be able to nurture them and uplift them and give them as much pleasurable experiences as possible. So, I mean, basically, yeah, in a society where we have access to ridiculous technologies, great medicines, food galore, and also everything was safe. Do you think we'd class more animals or more thinking creatures as having the status of personhood?
I'm not sure that abundance is necessarily the condition that would lead to it, but I think you're right that we will look back once we have synthetic meat and the capacity to humanely create meat substitutes that are satisfactory without animal domestication. It will only be sadists and people who with very exotic tastes who want to slaughter animals in order to do that, and we may in fact make that illegal. I'm sure my descendants will look back on my decision to continue to eat meat as barbaric as I look back on the early Neolithic period when there was a lot of human cannibalism. We look back on these, we find a lot of Neolithic settlements where there are a lot of human remains left in the stew pot. And we look back and think that that was barbaric. We in fact even think that it's a moral universal, but obviously it wasn't a moral universal because there are an awful lot of our ancestors who were eating each other. Our descendants will probably think it's a clear and obvious moral universal that you shouldn't eat animals, and I'm content to live in the interregnum between cannibalism and complete vegetarianism.
Interesting. So yeah, like I've heard stories where they found bones in pits. The Neanderthals may have been more cannibalistic than the Homo sapiens. And because they found bones in pits with knife marks on the bones in the same way that knife marks were made on bones of animals, suggesting that the meat was cut off in a similar way that they sort of cut meat of an animal. Yeah, it's kind of interesting to look back at some of the, well, now seemingly shady aspects of our history. It's interesting what's going to be the shady aspects of today that we'll look back on in the future, as you just mentioned.
Yeah.
So what do you see is the what do you see as the societal, ethical, and public policy challenges arising from accepting the personhood of sentient animals in the future?
Well, I make some pretty radical claims in Citizen Cyborg about that. I think, the agenda of this particular conference is simply, and the agenda of the Great Ape Project is simply to outlaw the use of apes and cetaceans in human entertainment and medical research, and to protect their habitats. Now, if you think about feral children, if the moral status, and this has been the argument of Peter Singer and people in this movement, if the moral status of great apes should be the same moral status as that of feral children, or children in general, human children, are our obligations to human children that we would find in the wild, living in Tanzania, in the jungle, would it be just to leave them there, or would it be to, in fact, take care of them and make sure that they had the full development of their capacities? So the argument that I make in Citizen Cyborg is more radical than the one that the Great Ape Project and most people in the animal rights movement would make, which is that they would stop at habitat protection and leaving them alone. I would say that we have more moral obligations to great apes and dolphins. And I've been influenced in thinking about that by David Brin's wonderful thinking and his series of novels called the Uplift novels. It's not that I believe that we actually live in an uplift universe. His proposal in that, the universe that he proposes in those novels, is one in which each species is obliged to adopt other species that are less cognitively evolved than it is, and forcibly, genetically, and culturally uplift them. And that we have started to do this in his novels with great apes and dolphins, and that this gives us certain moral status, credibility in the universe. And it's not that I believe that we live in that universe, but it's that I do think we have certain moral obligations to other species. As I said, the first moral obligation we have is just not to cause them unnecessary pain. But the other moral obligation, I think, is that for at least individuals, it may not be that we have obligations to entire species, but we at least have obligations to individuals to ensure that the ones that have the cognitive capacities that we associate with human children, that we give them the same capacities to develop their personalities and their cognitive abilities that we would try to give to a human child. So in other words, if you, for your 4-year-old, excuse me, for your 4-year-old, if you were to say, well, I'm perfectly content with the way you are, you don't have to learn to read, you don't have to learn about the world, just be yourself. You wouldn't be considered a good parent. If you're a guardian of a chimp, and you know that chimp has the capacity to read and to learn 500 symbols and words, and learn more about the world, and maybe paint or make music or whatever, why don't you have a similar obligation to this chimp in your lab or your zoo or whatever, to try to give them the opportunities to develop those capacities, if you think that those are important capacities for a conscious creature to have. And there are, in fact, enclosures that are working on that project that have given great apes, iPads to experiment with, and taught them all kinds of skills and interesting things. The next stage is that now that we've decoded the genome of chimpanzees and humans, and we know where we devolved, not only physiologically but neurologically, we're going to be able to identify which tweaks to neural architecture would be necessary to give, and which neurochemistries and whatever modifications would be necessary to give a chimpanzee or a great ape, a human, the next stage of development of their own cognition uplift, cognitive enhancement. And I think we do have an obligation to experiment in that direction. A lot of people don't, but I do.
That's interesting. Well, perhaps even more radical than your beliefs on the subjects are David Pearce's. And he suggests that, I'm not sure if that's the case, but he suggests that we should be setting up sanctuaries and not only uplifting animals cognitively, but morally. And so tigers wouldn't be going around chasing cassowaries and eating them or applying suffering in that manner, but could be kept content and happy by delivery of in vitro meat if needed, or some other form of sustenance. So there wouldn't. So the nastiness inherent in natural selection wouldn't cause suffering on any of the self-aware or putatively self-aware creatures. What are your
Right. Well,
thoughts?
far be it for me to describe anyone else's ideas as utopian, because certainly mine are. But and David is a fellow of the IEET and has been a longtime supporter of our work, and I've been very much influenced by his thinking on some of these topics. That is a plausible moral argument, and it rubs people in the wrong way, in the same way that my argument does, which is a lot of people think that the only obligation we have to other creatures is just to leave them alone. And they would consider it as offensive to the natural order of things to force a lion not to eat a lamb, as that would to force a chimpanzee to learn to read. And so I understand where the objections come from. I think it's a lot further down the singularity pike for us to imagine having the technology to engage in that kind of eco-engineering. But I can't imagine it. I mean, I can imagine having ubiquitous surveillance and nanobot, infestation of all the natural spaces on the planet, so that you would be able to get inside the minds of all the big carnivores and redirect their behavior and get them to eat synth meat instead of other creatures. So yeah, sure, why not? The lamb would fly down with the lion in the utopian paradise that we are creating.
Excellent. So have you already discussed in detail about the rights of non-human persons that you have a program within IEET?
Well, the rights program within the IEET has two components. One is to extend the legal and political basis for the possession of rights beyond humanness, so the expansion, the widening of rights. The other is the deepening of rights, in the sense that if you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was adopted by the United Nations, and most of the rights documents, like the US Bill of Rights or Japanese Constitution or something like that, the very few of them recognize the importance of technological enablement to the possession and exercise of rights. And one of the arguments that Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum have made, their philosophical work on what they call the capabilities approach to human development, which I've been very influenced by, is that technological enablement is very much a part of our exercise of rights. So in other words, it's very hard to imagine being a full possessor of rights in a modern society if you don't have access to healthcare. And healthcare is basically technological enablement, being able to ensure that you don't suffer constant chronic pain, or that you don't die of a simple infection, is access to certain kinds of technology. It's hard to imagine being a fully enabled citizen today without access to the internet, and that's technological enablement. But yet none of our rights talk yet has specifically focused on technological enablement as a component of our rights. So one of the arguments that I make in Citizen Cyborg, and it's one of the kinds of work that the IAT has done is to try to make the case to, for instance, feminists involved in reproductive rights work, so that it's not just about a matter of access to contraception and abortion as particular technologies of enablement. It's also the right of access to fertility drugs and treatments. It's the right of access to germinal choice, the right to control and determine what kinds of children you have. And this is where we get into trouble with the feminists who think that it's a feminist idea to throw obstetricians and women in India or China who want to know the contents of their own womb and have abortions on the basis of that knowledge or not, to throw them in jail is somehow a feminist act. We say no. What's in fact a feminist act is to establish that everyone, especially women, have a right to know the contents, know what's happening inside their own bodies, control whether or not to have children, control what kinds of children they're going to have. That's in fact full human enablement. Cognitive liberty is, we have to be very careful with cognitive liberty, and because there are downfalls of potentials of self-enslavement through addiction or self-crippling through other kinds of drugs. But in general, we live in puritanical societies that don't believe that we really should exercise full cognitive liberty, control the kinds of consciousness that we have, and we think that we should decriminalize certainly psychedelics and cannabis in Western societies. So there are specific ways in which this focus on a deepening of rights to include technological enablement and the right to control, to have access to the technologies that modify our cognition, our reproduction, or our genomes, our health, our physiological capabilities, bring together the transhumanist movement with a lot of the other human rights movements of our time.
Excellent. So, if you were in an elevator and you were the subject was brought up and you thought it was worth talking about personhood beyond the human to somebody who's not a sociologist, who hasn't spent time reading animal rights material, who's just, like an accountant, for instance, who's not dumb, but hasn't really spent like this particular accountant may not have spent a lot of time reading about these sorts of issues. How would you describe it to them? How would you describe this issue to them in such a way that maybe they would become interested and go away and think about it more in their own time?
How would I describe this particular conference?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Well, this particular conference, I would say, is the bringing together of people who are trying to establish legal rights for great apes and dolphins with people who are thinking about what those kinds of rights might mean in the future for human beings who modify themselves, or robots, other kinds of creatures. That's basically what the conference is. In terms of how it relates to any particular individual, I think that there is an avenue into lots of different corners, disability rights, reproductive rights, drug law reform, that there are connections and tangents for these arguments for most people's concerns, although they wouldn't necessarily all agree. They have to, at least the way that I construct the argument, they'd have to be pretty progressive to agree with most of the connections I would make.
Sure. Has there been any particular media responses to this conference, the theme of this conference, that you thought interesting, or other projects like it in the past?
Well, this topic engenders a lot of animus on the part of the scientific press, because there has been a radical wing of animal rights folks who have waged, acts of terror against people engaged in animal research. Not just great ape research, which I do think great ape research should be banned, but also research on, mice, has been a focus of some animal rights activists. And so when you get into this territory, I think it does raise hackles on the part of a lot of people in the scientific press. We've already got a press pass for the American Veterinary Medicine Association Journal. They want to come and cover the conference. But I think that we're also, I've been anticipating more anxiety about the conference from animal rights people than they actually have had. And as I said, I think many of them see this as a animal's nose under the tent kind of an issue. They think that we're all secretly, vegetarians, and I think they'll be surprised at how many of us on the transhumanist side don't see this as a wedge issue that eventually leads to vegetarianism. We see this as like, yes, dolphins and whales and chimps, and then robots and enhanced humans and aliens, but not necessarily the rats. Leave the rats out of it. And so we'll have some pretty frothy debates.
That sounds interesting. So there hasn't been any really controversial sort of media responses to this particular conference yet.
Well, it's still months away, so it's still brewing.
Yeah. Has there been any other conferences like it in the past?
No, I mean, there have been certainly bioethics conferences, animal rights conferences that have touched these issues. But one of the interesting things that's going to be happening at this is that the Non-Human Rights Project will be launching a series of lawsuits around the United States on behalf of great apes in captivity, and medical research is being closed down. But so most of their lawsuits will be around the use of great apes in entertainment and zoos and those kinds of settings to establish that they have certain kinds of rights. And so I think that those cases will be the focus of a lot of the media attention around the conference.
So if there's to be animal testing on monkeys that are close enough to be relevant to human beings, what does that include? Rhesus monkeys? I'm unclear where the term great apes start and begin. Start and end.
Well, great apes are only really 4 species: chimps, bonobos, gorillas. There's one other species of great ape.
Humans.
Humans, yeah. And then the cetaceans, it's the dolphins and the whales that are basically of concern. So yes, it's a very limited category. Rhesus monkeys are not great apes; they're monkeys. But more broadly, I would say, and one of the things that I point to in Citizen Cyborg is that I hope that transgenic animal models will increasingly provide better animal experimentation for human purposes than the simians and the primates do. There are a lot of physiological differences between primate physiology and human physiology that make it complicated to extrapolate from them. Like it's, one of the things that happen with primates is that they have more genetic diversity in general than human beings did, because we went through a narrow sphincter of genetic selection about 50,000 years ago with the last great ice age. And so there are only about 10,000 humans. And when you look at the X chromosome, there's, it goes back to like a dozen women, and you look at the Y chromosome, it goes back to like, 7 men. And so, we have a very narrow gene pool, even though we have different races of human beings and whatnot. It's actually a very narrow gene pool. And so that's created certain very different genetic anomalies in the human physiology compared to the more robust chimpanzee physiology, for instance. At any rate, when you try to do Alzheimer's research or something like that, it's a lot more useful if you can create an Alzheimer's model inside a rat brain and breed whole batch of Alzheimer's rats in a very short period of time than to try to do Alzheimer's research on a primate, which takes dozens and dozens of years to raise them to maturity and see the same kinds of effects. So I think that kind of transgenic research in rats and mice will be a lot more useful in the long run. The other thing is in silico biology, which is that our increasing ability to create computer models of biochemistry and biological processes will allow us to develop, discover new compounds, new kinds of drugs, to do technological, nanomedical research in silico, and then extrapolate it into the engineering environment. So there are all kinds of ways in which computing and gene synthesis of transgenic species will accelerate medical research, and we won't need simians and primates at all.
Excellent. So people can just go to nonhumanrights.net to find out more.
Exactly.
And it seems the date's on December 6th to 8th. I'll put this in the footer of the YouTube thing anyway. So
University.
Yeah, definitely. So we've got Peter Singer, who's coming along, George
Yes.
Zavorsky, you, but there's also Stephen M. Wise. Did you mention him before?
Yeah, he's the guy who wrote Drawing the Line, and he's the founder and principal at Non-Human Rights Project.
Sure. Okay. Laurie Gruen. Yeah. So it seems as though there's... Sorry?
We're going to have some of the leading researchers on great ape cognition and dolphin behavior there, but also some of the really interesting thinkers from the transhumanist and IET community about these issues. So we'll have Kevin LeGrandeur. He's recently written a book about pre-modern ideas about machine cognition that that we've had for hundreds and hundreds of years in the writings in Western Europe, and he's written a great book about that. So people like that, talking about all the philosophical and cultural issues around this struggle.
Yeah, that's interesting. I haven't actually read any of his material before. I see Wendell Wallach's coming as well.
Yep, Wendell will be there.
Yeah. Any news on whether David Brin can make it?
Well, we're trying to find the money to bring David in. He will at least talk as a Skype in at the conference, but he may in fact be there physically as well.
Yeah. Because I mean, he's one of the pioneering, I guess, thinkers in the science fiction space. It'd be great to have him there. I wish I could make it, but yeah. And it's $100, I think, for a registration.
Yeah, until September. We'll start ramping up the price in September.
Fair enough. All right. Well, is there anything that I've not asked you about the conference that you'd like people to know?
Oh, well, we could talk all night about this topics. No, I think we've covered the basics for now.
Definitely. Well, I guess people will have to come to the conference to find out more. Yeah, I'm certainly looking forward to some of the media that will be sort of created at the conference, the videos or the articles and all that. So yeah, very, very interesting topic indeed. All right.
Sure.
Cheers. Thanks very much for that, and looking forward to it.